In the spring of 2020, in a storeroom at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, a curator pulled a small cigar tin off a shelf where it had sat mislabeled for decades. The lid was stamped with the old flag of Egypt, yet it had been filed in the university's Asia collection. Inside were a handful of cedar splinters, dry and broken. They did not look like much, but those splinters were one of only 3 objects ever taken from inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, and they had been lost in the wrong drawer for 70 years. When the cedar finally reached a radiocarbon lab, the result broke the timeline. The wood dated to 3,341 to 3,094 BC. That is 5 centuries before Khufu, the pharaoh supposed to have built the pyramid around 2,560 BC. And here is what almost no one will tell you. A second, larger piece of that same cedar object is still inside the pyramid right now, sealed in a shaft. And in 30 years, not one expedition has gone back to test it. To understand why, we have to follow this wood backward. To a Victorian engineer in the Queen's chamber, and to a German robot that climbed a hidden shaft and ran straight into a sealed door. The curator was Abir El-Adani, and she was exactly the wrong person to fool. Before Aberdeen, she had spent years at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, so the moment she saw that flag on the tin, she knew it had been shelved on the wrong continent. She dug into the university's old records. The trail led back to 1946, when the box was donated by the daughter of a Scottish doctor named James Grant. And Grant, it turned out, had been inside the Great Pyramid in the 1870s, the day one of its strangest secrets came out of the wall. This was no tourist trinket. In the entire recorded history of the monument, only 3 objects have ever been pulled from sealed space inside it. Archaeologists call them the Dixon relics. There is a ball of dark dolerite stone, a small 2-pronged hook of copper, and these cedar fragments. The ball and the hook went to the British Museum in London, where they sit today. The cedar traveled north to Scotland, and then vanished into a drawer for the better part of a century. So why would a few splinters of old wood be enough to make headlines around the world? Because of what the lab did next. By the time El-Adani found it, the cedar had crumbled into loose pieces. The university sent samples off for dating, fully expecting the result to match the age of the pyramid. Instead, it landed 500 years too early. Neil Curtis, the head of museums and special collections at Aberdeen, gave the careful, sensible answer almost at once. The date, he suggested, might reflect wood from the center of a long-lived tree. That explanation has a name, the old wood problem, and we are going to give it a fair hearing, because it is far stronger than the channels shouting cover-up will ever admit. But hold that thought, because it leaves one question wide open. If this cedar really is older than the king himself, where did it come from? And how did it end up bricked inside a wall no human eye was meant to see again? The answer is not in Scotland. It is back at Giza in 1872, with an engineer who was not even looking for it, tapping the limestone of the Queen's chamber because of one of the oddest obsessions in Victorian science. The engineer was Wayneman Dixon, and he was not hunting for treasure. He was there for Charles Piazzi Smith, the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, a brilliant man with one strange fixation. Piazzi Smythe believed the Great Pyramid was built around a holy unit of measure he called the pyramid inch, and that its passages hid coded messages meant for the modern age. Serious Egyptologists thought the idea was nonsense, and they were right. But that obsession is the only reason an engineer, rather than an archaeologist, was down in the Queen's chamber in 1872, sounding the walls inch by inch alongside his friend, the physician, James Grant. That is when Dixon spotted it, a hairline crack in the southern wall, so fine that anyone else would have walked straight past it. He worked a thin rod into the gap, and the rod kept going. There was empty space behind the stone. So he called in a workman, a carpenter named Bill Grundy, and had him cut through the wall. Now pay close attention here, because this is the detail the loudest videos on this story get flat wrong. The shaft was not hidden behind plaster. The builders had cut a narrow channel running up into the body of the pyramid, but right at the mouth, where it met the Queen's chamber, they left the final couple of inches as solid limestone and dressed it smooth. From inside the room, that wall looked perfect, with no opening, no seam, and nothing to suggest a passage even existed. Somebody had sealed these channels behind a thin skin of stone, deliberately, then finished the surface so it matched every block around it. Grundy chiseled through that thin layer, and a shaft barely 8 inches wide opened up in front of them. A matching one turned up in the north wall. And waiting inside that shaft were the 3 objects, and the objects are the whole point. The dolerite ball is the same kind of pounding stone Old Kingdom crews used to dress and shape the limestone of Giza. One careful note here, because this is another spot where sloppy videos trip and get called out in the comments. Those dolerite balls pounded and smoothed stone. They did not cut it. The copper hook matches the fittings used during the actual construction. So these were not holy relics laid down by some later priest. They look like the working tools of the men who built the pyramid, sealed inside the day the wall went up. Which drags us right back to that impossible date. If the cedar was sealed in during construction, and the cedar is 500 years too old, then one of 2 things has to be true. Either the textbook timeline is wrong, or that wood was already ancient on the morning it was placed. And the mainstream has a clean, well-armed answer for exactly this. Before we send a single robot up that shaft, we owe that answer an honest look, because it is harder to knock down than the conspiracy crowd would like you to think. The answer is the old wood problem, and once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. Radiocarbon dating does not measure when a tree was cut, or when its timber went into a building. It measures, roughly, when the tree stopped drawing carbon from the air. In other words, when it died. And the cedars of Lebanon, the prized timber the Egyptians hauled across the sea, can live for 2,000 to 3,000 years. Picture a beam cut from the dead heart of a tree already 1,000 years old, then reused once or twice before it ends up inside the pyramid. Date that beam, and the wood reads centuries older than the stone around it. That is not a conspiracy, just plain chemistry, and it is real. Here is what makes the old wood explanation so hard to push aside. The Great Pyramid has been carbon dated before, and not from one stray splinter in Scotland. In 1984, and again in 1995, a major project scraped tiny flecks of organic material straight out of the mortar packed between the pyramid's blocks. The team included Mark Lehner, one of the most respected Giza archaeologists alive, alongside the Swiss physicist Georges Bonany, and the 1995 round was funded by the American industrialist David Koch. They published the results in the journal Radiocarbon in 2001, and the mortar dated old, too. The 1984 samples came back, on average, 374 years older than the history books allowed. The 1995 samples ran about 100 to 200 years older. So the Scottish cedar is not some freak accident. The whole building keeps reading too early. But the researchers had a ready answer, the same one as before, because nearly everything they pulled from that mortar was charcoal and old wood, the exact material thrown off by the old wood effect. They were not dating the day the pyramid rose. They were dating as Lehner's team put it, the shadow cast by 1,000 fires burning old wood. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, the documented kind, where the boring explanation gets a fair hearing before the wild one, take a second and subscribe. We chase down one of these every few days, and whether the channel grows comes down to whether you stay for the part that comes next. Because there is a crack running through the floor of that explanation, and it is the piece the competing videos walk right past. That same project did not only date the Great Pyramid. They also dated short-lived material from other Egyptian sites, things like reed and straw that sprout and die inside a single season and cannot be centuries old. At the first dynasty tombs of North Saqqara and at the Pyramid of Senusret II, those short-lived samples lined up almost dead-on with history, some off by only a handful of years. When the sample could not be ancient, the dates behaved themselves. The only time they ran wild was when the material might be old wood. And the Great Pyramid itself, Khufu's own monument, has never once been dated on fresh, short-lived material taken from its own structure. The one clean test on this specific pyramid has never been run, and that single gap sits at the quiet center of this whole story. The mainstream is not bluffing, though, and an honest film has to say so out loud. In 2013, the French archaeologist Pierre Tallet, digging at a Red Sea harbor called Wadi al-Jarf, uncovered something astonishing. Papyrus logbooks, the oldest inscribed papyri ever found, kept by an official named Merer. They describe Merer's crew ferrying fine white limestone to Giza for the Great Pyramid in the 27th year of Khufu's reign. That is direct, dated proof that Khufu's people were building at Giza. Stack on top of that the discovery back in 1837, when the explorer Howard Weiss found Khufu's name daubed in red paint by work gangs inside sealed chambers above the king's chamber, spaces no later visitor could have crawled into. There is a long-running argument over whether that graffiti is genuine or forged, and it deserves a film of its own. But put the papyri and the cartouche together, and you can see why almost every Egyptologist still plants Khufu firmly in the 26th century BC. So we have a genuine anomaly and a reasonable answer standing against it. That should be the end of it, except for one thing the answer cannot reach. There is a second piece of that cedar still lying in the shaft, and deeper inside the pyramid, behind another wall entirely, there is something that turns this from a quiet argument about chemistry into a much harder question about why nobody is allowed to look. In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink, hired to fit ventilation inside the pyramid, seized the chance to send a small tracked robot up the very shafts Dixon had opened. He called it Upu-Aut II, an ancient Egyptian name meaning opener of the ways, and ran it under the German Archaeological Institute. The robot crawled more than 200 feet up the southern shaft, and then it stopped, because the shaft stopped. The channel dead-ended at a small slab of fine limestone, set into the passage like a miniature door, with 2 corroded metal pins driven straight through it. It was a sealed door, deep inside the most famous building on Earth, and nobody had known it was there. Then something strange happened, which by now will feel familiar. Nothing. The discovery exploded across the news, and then the file simply closed. It took live television to reopen it. On the 16th and 17th of September, 2002, National Geographic aired a live special and sent a fresh robot up that same shaft, built by the Boston firm iRobot at a cost of around $250,000. With the world watching, it drilled a hole about 3/4 of an inch wide through that little door, threaded a camera through, and lit up a small empty space. And then, behind it, another blocking stone. The cavity was shallow, roughly 18 to 20 centimeters deep, later refined by Jedi to about 19. Zahi Hawass, watching the feed live, said it looked to him like the stone was sealing something behind it. And then the cameras packed up, the broadcast ended, and the questions got filed away again. This is the same pattern that hangs over the sealed room behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The one we walked through in another video, the chamber Egypt has still refused to open. Something extraordinary surfaces. The whole world leans in close, and then a door quietly swings shut. But that southern shaft got one final visit, and it is the one that matters most. In 2011, an international team launched a mission named Jedi, after a magician from the legends of Khufu's own court. The robotics were led by Professor Robert Richardson of the University of Leeds, with the mission managed by an engineer named Sean Whitehead. This time, the robot carried a bendable, snake-like fiber optic camera that could feed through the drill hole and curl around corners. For the first time, anyone could see the faces inside that shaft, blind to the world for 45 centuries. And what the camera found stopped everyone cold. On the floor of the little chamber were markings in red paint. One was a straight mason's line. The other three were figures that look like hieratic, an early form of Egyptian writing. One researcher, Luca Miatello, reads those marks as the number 121, perhaps the length of the shaft in cubits. That reading is one interpretation, not gospel, but the markings themselves are beyond doubt. The actual handwriting of the builders, left in a place no one was ever supposed to read. The camera also turned to the backs of the two metal pins and found that they ended in small, neatly finished loops. Whitehead concluded the pins were more likely decorative than structural, and that the back of the door had been carefully polished, which means somebody decided this hidden spot was worth the effort. And then the camera tilted down to the floor and found the detail. This whole story has been circling. Both of those copper pins had had their ends snapped clean off. The left one broke long ago, before 1993. The right one was snapped by the drilling robot back in 2002. And both broken ends, each only about half an inch long, were lying in the dust on the floor of the shaft. The Jedi team filmed them, logged them, and flagged them to be picked up on the next mission. That next mission never came. In January of 2011, the Egyptian revolution erupted. The Antiquities Administration was thrown into chaos, and Jedi's fieldwork stalled for good. As far as anyone knows, broken pins are still lying on that shaft floor today, in the exact spot the camera last saw them. It was not hidden away, and it was not locked in a vault. It was simply left behind a wall and forgotten for more than a decade. So pull back and look at what we are actually holding. A fragment of cedar sealed inside the Great Pyramid as it was being built, that carbon dates 5 centuries before the pharaoh history credits with raising it. A reasonable explanation, the old wood problem, never checked against fresh material from the monument itself. A second, larger piece of that exact cedar, still resting in the shaft, never retrieved and never dated, that could put the old wood question to rest in a single afternoon. If it really is old wood, the second piece will match the first, and the argument is over. And on the floor of that same shaft, a broken sliver of ancient copper, filmed by a robot in 2011, flagged for collection, then abandoned the moment the cameras switched off. None of this needs a secret to make sense. There is no hidden vault, no organized cover-up, nothing that calls for aliens or a drowned civilization. The truth here is quieter, and somehow stranger for it. The tests that would answer these questions are cheap. The samples are already broken loose and waiting. Reaching that pin fragment would not even take a new hole in the stone, only a robot sent back to lift what is already lying on the floor. And in more than 30 years, across 4 Egyptian governments and a dozen expeditions, not one of them has done it. Which brings us back to that cigar tin in Scotland, shelved on the wrong continent, ignored for 70 years until a single curator decided to open the lid. The most important object ever taken from inside the Great Pyramid spent most of a century forgotten in a drawer. Its twin is still in the wall. The copper is still on the floor. And the one set of tests that could finally tell us who raised the most studied structure on Earth, and when, remains, after all this time, the test that no one has been willing to run. The answer may be sitting down there in the dark right now, waiting. All it would take is for someone to decide to go and look.